They are. Awesome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you that are joining us, it's 7:07. We had some technical difficulties, but we managed to make it work. I'm very, very happy about that. We're also just a bit late. That's okay. I'm really excited again. I had John McManus with us on Tuesday night, and we talked about internal revolution, and we got some great insight from the absolute Birch perspective, and it was perfect. And I appreciate John for joining me on Tuesday. He's decided to join me again tonight, and we're going to be getting into the United Nations. A lot of people are under some delusion that the United Nations is a good thing for the world and all of that, and we'd like to be able to get John's Birch perspective on what all that looks like. So, John, I appreciate you joining me. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, in case people didn't watch on Tuesday, would you give a brief introduction about who you are and where you came from and how you got involved with the John Birch Society?
Well, where I came from is Brooklyn, New York, a small town back east, and I went to Holy Cross College in Massachusetts, took a commission in the Marine Corps, served for 3 years, 57 to 60, left the Marine Corps and got a job in the electronics industry, and did that for 6 years. But it was during that period that I started doing some heavy thinking about what's happening in our country and so forth. One of the first things I did was to get myself a subscription to National Review, William Buckley's magazine. I loved it at first, and before too long, I learned that Buckley was pulling his punches and so forth, and he started attacking the John Birch Society. Well, I went to John Birch Society meetings, and I bought a set of books called A Dozen Candles. I started reading those books, and say my blood pressure went up. I began to say to myself, this country is really in trouble. So I joined the society. I very quickly had a chapter going, and then we brought in speakers. And then they asked me in 1966 to join the staff. And I started out as a coordinator doing the same thing you do. I had 5 New England states, but of course they're all small in the area, and I was able to get around to all 5. And then in 1968, they asked me to move into the headquarters and take a job helping to run the Speakers Bureau and the ad hoc committees, which I did for a while. In 1973, Robert Welsh appointed me as the public relations director for the society. And in 1991, I became president. And in 2015, I became president emeritus. I am now, I guess you could say, a little bit on the shelf, but glad to continue helping in any way I can.
Well, your insight and your as long as you've been around is hugely important to us. And sometimes I wonder what would happen if something were to happen to some of those people that that really has made the John Birch Society what it is. I mean, there's that wisdom and that knowledge, that desire and the understanding of the urgency of the times that I just think is completely...
Well, what you just said is what we used to think about Robert Welch. And of course, he passed away in 1983, but we managed to keep going and did a lot more and did a lot of different things, obviously. And here we are. Now we have a fellow named Tom Munds working for us, and we look forward to him being a star in the field, and wish you the best.
Well, I've got to tell you, just you saying those words to me just makes me feel even more part of history, and it's a very warm feeling I have. So thank you for that, and I do everything I can for the sake of the country and to make JBS proud. So, in my mind, I could never do enough. So I got to go ahead.
Let me, I did serve for 3 years in the Marine Corps. I was an officer, And I grew to have a tremendous amount of respect and affection for the platoon. A platoon leader in the Marine Corps is somewhat like what the coordinator is in the John Birch Society. And the battle gets done because of the people in the field, and you're the people in the field. You lead the people in the field very much the same as a platoon leader would in the Marine Corps. So we're glad to you. We appreciate you, and we wish you all the best.
Well, thank you. So I got to ask you this, since you said that you were coordinator, and even though I knew that and I didn't catch on to that, I've got to ask you, when you went from what you were doing to becoming part of the field staff, what kind of transition was that for you? Do you remember?
Well, it really wasn't that terribly much because I was already a chapter leader and I was spending a lot of
Oh,
my evenings working for the society, getting people to come to a program, getting people involved, uh, distributing books and literature, and urging my chapter members on and so forth. Same kind of thing goes on today.
I just find it's such a eclectic mix, because people will say, they'll ask me what being a coordinator is like, and what kind of things that JBS looks for in coordinators and things of that nature. And I thought, man, not everybody has, people might have one or two of the issues, or the abilities, maybe sales, or the ability to communicate or to speak or to, present. And a lot of it too is the importance of the Birch perspective, or the worldview that the society has. And when they picked me up, they were pretty surprised I had the library that I did. So I must have done something right, definitely. So
Good.
I'm pretty happy
Well,
about that.
we're glad you did.
Yeah. Well, so tonight's conversation really is to be able to talk about the United Nations. But before I get into that, I wanted to ask this question last night, and I kind of failed to. Out of all the organizations that exist on the planet or in our country that you're aware of, why the John Birch Society?
Why the John Birch Society?
Yeah. I
For
mean,
me, or
if we were going to appeal to, people that are not members right now, what would you say about why you chose the John Birch Society over any other organization that you could have been part of?
well, first of all, it was a nationwide organization. There were a lot of small uh, city organizations, even statewide organizations. There wasn't anything of a national uh, style. Robert Welch was very emphatic about that. We want to build the John Birch Society in every state in the United States, and even in foreign countries. We do have members in foreign countries, by the way. I don't know whether you knew that. I'm in communication with a man who lives in here already, and he knows the Birch Society as well as anybody, and he's very anxious for us to proceed and to keep going. Same with people in Australia that I got to know. I was invited to go to Australia for a time. Oh, I don't know, it'd be 20, 25 years ago. I spent 3 weeks in Australia helping them. Uh, they wanted to build a John Birch Society in their country, not a John Birch Society, but something like the John Birch Society. I said, well, first thing you got to think about is you got to have a manifesto. What's a manifesto? A manifesto is a blue book,
Mm-hmm.
a blue book of the John Birch Society. And when I read that, I said, well, not only does this man, Robert Welch, come across as a really good American, he knows a lot of history, he knows organization tactics, he knows this, he knows that. And somebody I wanted to put in my time with. And that's an attitude that a lot of people shared throughout the country. I can recall reading about this. I wasn't a member at the time. I didn't join the society until 1964. But I remember reading about the fact that Robert Welch was invited to a meeting of a patriotic organization in Chicago that had quite a membership, maybe as many as 1,000 people, right? And he was going to be the main speaker at this event. So he gave him a talk called Republics and Democracies, and he blew the socks off them.
Wow.
Most people, even there, were considering our country a democracy. And of course, it's not, never has been. We don't want it to become one. We don't want the rule of a mob. We want the rule of a law. And it's very simple. So that became a very big item with me and my own agenda.
Oh, that's great. So, getting into the United Nations, what makes the UN one of our longest standing, I guess for lack of a better word, campaigns? I mean, that's one of the flagship agenda items that we're known for, right?
That's correct. And I'm glad we are.
Is there anybody else that's, well, I should ask that next. Go ahead.
The United States is built on what the content of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The Declaration contains that thunderous assertion: men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And it goes on to talk about the fact that nobody can take them away. God gave them to us, and only God can take them away. And he has given no indication that he intends to do that. All right. Go to the United Nations, and what do you see? Well, you see a lot of very flowery language, but you also see not only does the United Nations list the same kind of rights that we like and we want and so forth, but in every case it says until we suspend them, we retain the right to destroy those rights and so forth. You can't do that in America if you believe in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So that separates us from the rest of mankind. What happened at the founding of the United Nations, the United States, excuse me, never happened before. An acknowledgement of a creator and the fact that we get our rights from that creator, and therefore they can't be taken away. So we should never have been involved in the United Nations to begin with. Now, I'm old enough to remember the year 1945, especially talking with my dad about the whole subject. Dad, what do you think? Should our country join the United Nations? And he said yes. He said, we had World War I, we had World War II, we don't want to have World War III, and so let's give it a try. And that's the way it was sold to the American people. It was sold to my father, who was a very patriotic American. He lived to regret that decision, and so on. So the American people were told that the UN was going to prevent war, and we weren't going to have any more wars. We've had more wars since the UN started than at any other time in the history of our country. So it's a failure in that regard, but it's also a dangerous failure.
Can you, I was talking to one of our congressmen and about the dangers of the USMCA. And all of my congressmen said, you know, Tom, it's if it is bad, we can just decide that we don't want to be a part of it. What do you say to that? We could just, like this part, we can choose, we can pick and choose the Declaration of Rights or the treaties or the agreements that we have, and we can distance ourselves from others. What do you say to that?
Well, yes, we can. We can pull out of the UN. We could pull out of NATO. We could pull out of the US MCA that they just got us involved in. You can do all kinds of things, except that they don't do it. Yeah. And why don't they do it? Because the people back home are not demanding that they do it.
Yeah,
we get the kind of government we earn, and there aren't enough Americans who have earned the kind of leadership at the Congress level, at the presidential level, and so forth that we want. And our job in the John Birch Society is very simple: wake the town and tell the people, and then the people will choose better leaders. And that's, as you know, that's exactly what your job is.
Yeah, education. Yeah. Well, so, and So what I'd like to be able to do is ask you if you could tell us a little bit, if we could lay the groundwork just a little bit, if that's okay. If you could tell us a little bit about the history, since Americans don't seem to know it, before the creation of the UN, even before the League of Nations. Can you take us back as far as you care to and kind of set the stage for us about what was going on at the time?
Well, we never should have been involved in World War One, and we were involved in World War One to set the stage for our country to join the League of Nations. And happily, there were enough senators at that point in time, after World War One ended, that we didn't join that. And I wrote a piece about the irreconcilables, the senators who refused to get us into the League of Nations way back in 1919, 1920. And one of the leaders of that was a senator from your state. His name was Borah, B-O-R-A-H. And he was very much opposed to the United Nations, the League of Nations. And
Wow.
he got out. Now, when the League of Nations wasn't going to succeed because the United States didn't get involved, it was formed. It continued to do this or that, whatever it could do without the United States involvement. And when the UN was finally started in 1945, I think it was 2 years after that, the League of Nations folded up its doors, gave all its assets to the UN and said, okay, you can carry on now. You've accomplished what we never did. You got Uncle Sam into the United Nations. And that was a big deal. Now, go back to that period, 1945, and it was debated in the US Senate. It should have been debated in the House of Representatives as well, but it wasn't. They pulled a fast one on that. They said, no, we'll just get Senate approval. They said it was a treaty. No, it's not a treaty. It's more than a treaty. So they finally had a vote in the Senate, and the vote amazingly was 89 in favor, only 2 against. Only 2 senators said no to the United Nations. Those 2 are Shipstead of Minnesota and Langer of North Dakota. Most people never even heard those names, never even heard of those members of the Senate. But they gave speeches to their colleagues. I dug out the speeches at the Boston Public Library one day, and I found out that what they had been saying was absolutely right on target. It was absolutely wonderful to read how well those 2 men had read this charter of the UN, saw through it, said that this is going to lead to damaging consequences for our country. Now, I have a booklet here called America and the United Nations, something I wrote. Information about those 2 senators is there, but this is a brief analysis of the United Nations. And anybody who's a member of the Birch Society should have read this maybe 2 or 3 times, got that information under their belt, and be able to discuss it with others. And the way to do that is to, you go to somebody and you ask a question. You find somebody who's a little concerned about what's happening to our country. Said, well, let me ask you this. Are you aware that we've been in Afghanistan for 19 years and there's no sign of getting out? And it's being run by the United Nations? What do you mean? What? It's being run by the United Nations? Yeah, well, we originally went there right after the 9/11 disaster in New York City, the buildings coming down, the planes crashing into them. And wasn't shortly after that, it was turned over to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Well, NATO is a part of the United Nations. So the United Nations, the NATO organization, part of the United Nations, was calling the shots on what we do in Afghanistan for years. Now, they recently went through the procedure of withdrawing NATO command, but they went to another different UN command, and we're still under the United Nations. And we'll stay in the Afghanistan region for as long as the United Nations demands that behind the scenes. I would gather that not too many US senators know that. And it's up to people like you and me and members of the Birch Society across the country to tell that amazing truth to a lot of people.
Yep. So I wanted to ask you, when you were talking about treaties and agreements, there's been some confusion for that. Can you clarify the difference between a treaty and an agreement for some of the listeners?
Well, an agreement, what I'm thinking of is something that is voted in by the House and the Senate, and a majority has to approve and so forth. A treaty gets you in bed with another country, far more so than anything. The UN is not a country, and therefore it's not a treaty. It can't be a treaty. It wasn't from the start. But they decided that only the Senate had to vote on this, and the Senate went ahead and did that. There were some senators who were very much opposed to the United Nations, but they voted for us to go into it anyway, because the American people had been so heavily propagandized that we got to do something different to forestall being involved in another war. So we got involved in the UN, and we went to Korea, fought a war and lost. We went to Vietnam, we fought a war and lost. We went to Iraq twice. We haven't fought a war and won a war since World War II, when we weren't involved in the United Nations.
So why or how did and I know you passed on this already, but I wanted to make sure I brought this home for the viewers. Why or how did the League of Nations fail? I mean, did the United States decide to decline its acceptance into the League of Nations, but it ended up passing accepting its way into the United Nations?
Well, that was the difference between 1921 and 1945. Mm-hmm. That's 30 plus years. And the character of the American people began to change. Back then, in the 1920s, people were more interested in watching out for their government and putting good, honorable men in charge of the Senate, the House of Representatives, and so on. And more, it became a case of American people voting for somebody who's going to do something for me. He's going to form an organization, and I can get some money from the federal government. I can do the federal government will do this for me, will do that for me, not for the country as at large. And that's something that happened over the course of those 21 years, now 31 years. Right after the United States decided not to get involved in the League of Nations, and that was 1919, 1920, the US formed an organization called the Council on Foreign Relations. And the Council on Foreign Relations had, right from its beginning, persuading the American people to accept world government. And they did an awful lot with Rockefeller money and Carnegie money and a lot of the Gottschalk's people in our country financing a transfer of the sovereignty of our country to a new world organization. Very bad move on their part. And we suffer from that today. And it was, of course, those people, and incidentally, and their purchase of mass media outlets. Newspapers were far more potent back then than they are today, although they're still potent. Today, most people get their news from television and radio, and it too is deceitful. It's not telling the whole story. I'll listen to a news broadcast, and my blood pressure goes up.
Mine too. I
Yeah.
I got rid of my TV a long time ago. But so I think pertinent to today, though, we should probably capitalize or talk about the fact that from what I read, the what a really good part of what got us into the United Nations was the fear that was instilled in the people around the world, right? I mean,
Well,
this was
yeah.
supposed to, this was create, go ahead.
Well, and one of the things, of course, at that point was the atom bomb. The atom bomb had been dropped on Japan. Japan had been trying to surrender as far back as January of 1945. And we wouldn't let them surrender until we had the bomb and dropped the bomb on the people in Japan. And it was a horrible crime. I wrote a long article about that for the New American Magazine. And it surprised me that I was getting calls from professors who were digging into the subject of the United States and the atomic weaponry and so on, asking me questions about what I had written. So I said, well, you've already read my article. Yes. And I got thanks from some people about the fact that I had put it all together. But I knew, and there were others who knew, that the Japanese had been trying to surrender, but they weren't going to be allowed to surrender until we dropped the bomb and scared a lot more Americans into wanting to get involved in a world government.
Wow.
That was a horrible crime, and if something was done by our country. I remember reading about one Japanese dignitary who was discussing the fact of the bomb and the damage that was done to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he said, if you wanted to demonstrate the power of the atom bomb, you could have detonated it over the ocean.
Yeah.
But they did. They did, and it wasn't even a military base that we dropped it on. It was mostly civilians.
Yeah. I know I've been called unpatriotic for mentioning the UN's involvement with our military and some of the things that we've actually done, and it's very disheartening for me. So, John, the common question for me that I get all the time is, but the UN is a good thing. So, is it a good thing? I mean, obviously we've talked about the fact that it isn't, but I guess I'm just reiterating because the next question is going to be, they do good things, right?
Well, let's go back to the first question. It's a good thing, right? Try to tell that to the people in Katanga.
Yeah, I was hoping you were going to bring that up.
Katanga is a province of the country called Congo. It was the Belgian Congo, and then it became Zaire, and now it's back to just being Congo, all right? A communist took control of that country, a man named Patrice Lumumba. There's a large portion of that country called Katanga that was the breadbasket of the country. It was a popular place. It was a place where there was industry, there was agriculture, and it was led by a fine human being named Moïse Chambé. He seceded from the Congo and wanted to set up his own country. The United Nations said, no, you can't do that. And he said, I just did. And he was very adamant about it. So what did the United Nations do? Well, they came in and militarily destroyed much of Katanga. They dropped bombs on hospitals. They killed civilians. The blue helmeted UN people did their job and forced Katanga to submit. Well, they were managed to escape in some respects. They did stay as part of the Belgian Congo, the former Belgian Congo. And Moïse Chambé made a mistake of accepting an invitation to attend a meeting in Europe. And in order to get there, of course, he had to fly. So he got in a plane, and the plane landed in Algeria, and he got off the plane and was never seen again. And that was the end of Katanga being an independent entity. So the United Nations, if back then it was a case of if you didn't go along and bow and submit to the United Nations would bomb the heck out of you, which is exactly what they did.
We had a speaker come out, Peter Gallo, the UN whistleblower, speak a couple of years ago out here, and he shares articles with me still that even openly exposes, the child trafficking and all of the other abuses. So it's not like what we're saying isn't true. The media, it's even out there. It's just the exposure of it is actually limited. So I was just really surprised.
You've probably seen the article that I did about the 10 top reasons why we should leave the United Nations.
Yeah.
I meant to have a copy of that handy, and let me go get it. It's right over here in my file. Okay, I'm back. I've got the handout. This is a handout, right? The first reason why we should get out. UN grants rights that it can cancel. The US recognizes God-given rights that can't be canceled. That's the first reason. Second reason is the United Nations wants the American people. Happily, there are 300 million Americans who have a gun. Third, the UN's a lawless body that violates its own charters. Article 2, that forbids intervening domestically in matters within the country itself. And that goes on all the time. I remember out in your part of the world, your part of our country, there's some people who wanted to start a mine up in Montana, and the UN said it would impede a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which was Yellowstone Park, and it would damage that. And there was no evidence to support that. And so the mine never got going. Each of the 10 men who have served as UN Security Secretary General has been a communist or a socialist. Right up until today. Today, the head of the United Nations is a guy from Portugal. I've forgotten his name, but he was involved with the communists in Portugal, right? The first Secretary General, only for a part of time, was Alger Hiss, who went to prison for lying about the fact that he was a communist, right? So
that's some pretty good evidence right there.
And there are 10 reasons, and of course, I've just given you a sentence out of each of the 10 reasons. There's more information in a booklet that goes through all of the 10 very much more in detail.
That's a great palm card.
This or because of that, every one of those things can be answered. And I think it's up to the members of the Birch Society to get themselves well enough aware of what the UN really is and has been all these years, so that they can respond to that when they meet somebody. And the way to do it is, as I said before, ask questions. Are you aware that the 10 leaders of the United Nations over these years have all been communists or socialists? Let me back up a minute here and say that a lot of people think that socialism is, well, I don't care for it, but it's not communism.
Mm-hmm.
right? Right. So, I could live under socialism, right? Well, they, they don't seem to remember that the USSR stood for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And socialism was always the goal. In fact, I contend that socialism is more a threat to freedom than even communism. All right. Now, why do I say that? If some communists take control of your country, they do so, and they have to form a KGB or a NKVD or something like that, because there's still a lot of resistance and they have to knock it down. If you become a socialist country, it's because you voted yourself into that condition and resistance is destroyed in the process. So the goal is socialism. And you got a nice old man named Bernie Sanders running around the country, boasting of being a socialist, getting thousands, tens of thousands, and hundreds of thousands of people to vote for him to be president of the United States. And he didn't make it, of course. But now you've got a rising cadre of people in the Congress of the United States who are out and out socialists, who think Bernie Sanders walks on water, and so on. We don't want socialism. We don't want communism. We want Americanism.
And I don't think the average person necessarily wants socialism or communism. They just want to redefine it. They just want to redefine what they are, so it's more appealing to the ears. If it tickles the ears.
Well, a lot of people want to be dependent on government.
Yeah.
And that's more and more the case. I've seen that develop in my lifetime. It was not the case back in the 40s. I had a classmate from college. I went to college in the 50s, the middle of the 1950s. And a friend of mine who one of my classmates, he said, we were so fortunate to grow up in the 50s. And I had to stop and say, yeah, you're right. Right. It was a good time to grow up.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That must have been something. I always wonder what that would be like. Well, so for me, go ahead.
But look at what you've got today. You've got a country that's in trouble. You're still a free American, and you can help get America back to its roots. Less government, more responsibility, God's help, a better world. You can accomplish that. You and thousands of people like you across the country. We already have thousands. We need tens of thousands. We need many more people in the Birch Society. And so while I'm on a program like this, I'll say to anybody who's listening, join the Birch Society. You won't be sorry. You'll be better informed. You'll meet some wonderful friends, and we can save our country if we get enough muscle to be able to do it.
Yeah. Well, so I got to ask you, this question comes up for me a lot too. So going down the conspiracy hole, right? Okay. Is the United Nations the controlling entity, or are there actually people that are controlling the UN? And you mentioned it a little bit earlier. So if you wanted to go into a little detail, please do.
People who are controlling the UN. Yeah, the answer to that is the second of the alternatives you presented. The UN is their tool, and they want what is called a new world order. You want evidence of the fact that a new world order is what is wanted by the elite, by the power brokers, by the men behind the scenes. Well, just look at your dollar bill. Right on the back of it, you've got a pyramid with an eye, and you've got the slogan Novus Ordo Seclorum, which freely translated to New World Order.
It's a little hard to beat that.
Huh?
It's hard to beat that.
Yeah, well, we don't want a New World Order.
No.
We want to get back to Americanism.
Yeah.
Recognized by people outside the United States as the finest governmental system ever dreamed up by the mind of men. And they did so, the men who did that did it because they'd studied history. They knew that government had to be limited. They knew that government had to exist. And they wanted to give it only certain powers. If you had asked George Washington or Jefferson or Madison or John Adams or any of those people, should we form a world organization? They would have said, get out of here. What are you kidding me? Right? No, we got our own country. Let's make our country the best country. And we have had many leaders of our country who were very willing to share the wisdom of the founding fathers of this country, say, go thou and do likewise in your country. And some of them have been able to do some of that, and we're glad to see that. But now they want to imitate the United States, and the United States has lost its, they've lost the admiration that a lot of countries always had for us.
I just remember Joe the plumber not too long ago when he questioned about socialism. That really put Obama in quite the position, and now we have people that are begging for it. It's just
That's
amazing
right.
how fast things change. So so aren't other nations aware of the evils of the United Nations? I mean, so you talked about the Congo and some of that stuff, but it would seem to me that if the UN is such a, I call it an evil organization, but if it's so bad, don't other nations know it?
Some of them do and some of them don't. And some of them are led by people who are aspiring individuals wanting to have a job at the UN, wanting to be a part of it. I had a very interesting experience. I can't remember now exactly when, but I would say it's 15, 20 years ago. I was invited to Switzerland. Switzerland was about to vote on whether or not to join the UN. They were one of very few countries of the so-called educated lands that hadn't been a part of the UN. So I gave them a couple of talks and I urged them to continue their efforts. So they had a plebiscite. They do that a lot in Switzerland. They vote by majority rule at the polls on issues. I don't recommend that, but that's
Yeah.
that's up to Switzerland. But anyhow, there are 23 cantons, and a canton is the equivalent of a state in Switzerland. And finally, they took the vote, and then they lost 12-11, and Switzerland joined the United Nations.
I thought they were still autonomous, and they hadn't had a war. And somebody said that they hadn't had a war in 800 years, and I thought, well, geez, the UN must not be involved then.
Well, one of the things about Switzerland that's very interesting is that all young males are required to do military time. I don't know how long it is. It's probably a year. And at the end of the year, they are told to take the machine gun that they've been training with, take it home.
Wow.
So that's why Germany didn't invade Switzerland.
That sounds amazing. That sounds like yeah, that sounds amazing. So when we were talking about how other nations really kind of are or aren't aware of that, how has everyone that understands the evil of the United Nations been so powerless to stop it?
Not enough of them were. They were sold what my own dad was sold. It's a peace organization, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a peace organization. It's like saying Martin Luther King is the architect of nonviolence, and yet he advocated violence. And that was his 4-part strategy, was to create violence in the streets so that the government would come in and pass new laws and take away more freedoms. He actually said that. Yet he became the apostle of nonviolence. Well, the United Nations has the reputation of being the great peace organization, which is a lie. It's not. Katanga proved that. There have been other instances where the United Nations flexed its muscle. Nothing as dramatic as what happened in Katanga. And that was way back in 1961, I believe.
Yeah.
I had an interesting thing happen recently. I went to a local doctor. I had my blood checked. Nothing to do with coronavirus. Uh, and the guy who did the checking was a huge black guy. And I got chatting with him. And I said, let me guess, you're from some country I named. And he said, no, no. I said, okay, where are you from? He said, I'm from Congo. I said, oh my goodness. Uh, are you perhaps from Katanga? He said, no, but uh, I said, do you know what happened to Katanga in 1961? He said, no, I don't. Tell me what happened. I said, the United Nations came in and bombed it to smithereens. He said, what? I had an extra copy of the book we had about that, and I gave it to him. And I'm waiting to go back and see him again and ask him if he read the book. Or I told him, I said, well, when you read it, send it to your family still back in the Congo so that they know too.
So, John, what's the name of that book that you were talking to about Katanga?
I think it's just called Katanga.
Okay. Well, I just didn't know if we still had it for sale in the bookstore or
I don't
if it's
think
out
we
of print.
do.
Okay.
It's out of print, right?
Okay.
But you meet an old member of the Birth Society who's probably got it in his library, and maybe you can talk him out of it.
Well, we lost a couple of members last year, and as sad as it was, the silver lining of that was that they willed me their libraries. So my
Oh,
wife
good.
wasn't real thrilled, but I was ecstatic. She says, "You're never going to read all these." I said, "But I'm going to do everything I can to try."
Well, you don't have to read the entire book. I recommend that, of course,
Yeah,
but you get a portion of a book, and then you're in good shape.
yeah, that's great. So let's see. So how can we appeal to our officials without looking like kooky, radical, fringe conspiracy people? Is there a way to
Well,
do that?
don't ever run away from the attitude of conspiracy. I mean,
I don't.
uh, well, yeah, I know you don't,
I
but a lot of
can't.
people, a lot of you say something that's dramatic and so forth. Oh, you sound like a conspiracy theorist.
Mhm.
No, I'm not a theorist. I'm a
Yeah.
factist. You know, but uh, how could you explain turning our country away from its roots? How can you explain that that happened, except to say that some people made it happen, and that's a conspiracy right there.
I think people are brainwashed to believe that, everything in moderation is okay. It's when you take a solid side on one side or the other, that you're fringe. You hear that all the time. They say, oh, there's fringe on both sides. So anybody that is not on either side is somebody that's willing to be able to compromise. But it's
Yeah,
never really both sides that compromise. It's usually only one. One side gives up all the ground in the name of compromise. So I always, ask people.
that attitude of conspiracy is what made the difference for the John Birch Society. When the John Birch Society was formed in December of 1958 and started to gather people into its organizational structure, the difference was the John Birch Society was saying what's happening to our country is not happening by chance. It's going to lead to big troubles, and it's being done deliberately. It's a conspiracy. That's what made the difference. That's what made the difference for me. I know that when I decided that there were people in powerful positions within my country who were willing to undo the country and lead us into socialism or eventually into communism, whatever. Uh, I looked at I had three children at the time. I have a fourth now too. I said, I got to do something for them, uh, not necessarily for myself.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's it's something that definitely needs to be done. It's invasive enough, and we just need to continue to push on to get as many people as we can to understand it. There was a New American issue not too long ago, and I can't even remember. I asked headquarters, and I don't know if they remembered either. But in the quote section, one of the congressmen said, "If the John Birch Society is listening, I wish that they would send a get us out of the UN bumper sticker to every person in Congress. And I've thought about that, and I've thought about it, and I thought about it, and I think it would be so fun to be able to get national support to be able to do that, to let that congressman know that we were listening. Do you remember that, or do you recall that at all?
Well, I write the quotes.
Oh, there you go. Well, then maybe I was imagining it. But if you do remember
No,
it,
no.
it would sure be fun to find.
Well, it it can be found, I'm sure, but I don't. It, if we're going to send something to every congressman, then send this.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
Yep.
You can buy a couple of hundred of these for $10. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what the charge is for them, but that's a good project. Let everybody send a message to their congressman and their two senators saying it's time for us to get out of the United Nations. And here's 10 reasons why. They're listed right here. Right?
I just wanted to send a letter to the congressman. You asked, we listened. So I thought it would be kind of fun. So are there other organizations, John, that that work like we do to be able to expose the darkness, if you will, of the United Nations?
Not so much the United Nations. I remember going to a meeting called by people who wanted to slam the United Nations down in the meeting was held in the House office building, in one of the buildings. They had gotten permission to use the building. And so there were people who were there for agricultural reasons and this reason and that. The anti-abortion people were there and so on. And I listened, and every one of them was condemning the United Nations for something. So finally, time it came to ask questions. And I raised my hand and they acknowledged me. I told them who I was, that I was representing the John Birch Society. I said, I've kept waiting all this time for somebody to say it's time to get out of the United Nations. Why isn't that brought up? And there were a couple of weak answers, and they really didn't answer the question. So the meeting was over, and I went up to the individuals and to say hello again and so forth. And they looked at me and they said, I agree with you. We should get out of the United Nations. Why didn't you say it? Why doesn't your organization say it? Right? And I don't know. It's probably because they got a financier who doesn't want them to say it.
Yeah. Wow.
It's hard to.
Well, so if you can recall, what have been some of the most shining moments that have sort of brought traction to the issue of the UN?
From the point of view of the UN itself?
No, for those that are
for-
opposing the UN, yeah.
For our efforts.
Yeah.
Well, we forced the measure in the House of Representatives one time to cease all funding to the United Nations. That's tantamount to getting out.
Mm-hmm.
And the vote in the Congress was 171 in favor of that. That was one shining moment.
Yeah.
Right. And unfortunately, a lot of those congressmen aren't there anymore. But that was good news to us that our campaign had some clout. Let me tell you a quick story too. Congressman Ron Paul has always been a favorite of the members of the Birch Society for good reason, right? He served in Congress, then he left, went back to doctoring. And about 10 or 12 years later, he decided he had to get back to Congress. So he ran again and won again. And he got into Congress for a second time. He served more than 20 years total. But when he got back in the second time, I got a call from a young member of the Birch Society, a gal. And she said, I want to go to work for Ron Paul. Can you help me out? I said, well, what do you want to do? She said, I want to do whatever he asks of me. I'll answer the telephone. I'll stuff envelopes. I'll do whatever I can to help him. I said, okay. Are you willing to move to Washington, D.C.? And she said, I don't want to do that, but I will. So she did. She was there 2 or 3 years. And she finally got the idea to contact the Library of Congress, and she asked them to send her every measure that had ever been introduced in the House of Representatives to get us out of the United Nations. And of course, she's calling from Ron Paul's office, and you do that with the Library of Congress, they feel that that's something the congressman wanted to have done. So she got that information, and she said she got a good stack of stuff. She was pleased to know that there were that many. And so she took them home and she started working on it. And she put together the list of reasons why the United States should get out of the United Nations. And she took it into Ron Paul and she said, Mr. Congressman, I have a favor to ask you. I'd like you to introduce this on the floor of the House, but look at it and let me know if it's worthy. So he said, okay, I'll take a look at it. A couple of days later, he came to her and he said, absolutely right on target, good for you. I changed one word. You said get out immediately. I said give him 2 years. Right?
Wow.
That was a member of the John Birch Society. Right?
Yeah.
Now, she wouldn't have done that if she hadn't been in the Birch Society and hadn't been educated about what it was all about and didn't know enough of the procedures and so forth. So that bill has continued. Ron Paul isn't in Congress anymore, but the congressman who does introduce that bill uses the same structure.
So how do you feel about, Trump has been quite a controversial character on his positions and what comes out of his mouth for a lot of people. But how do you feel about what you see about with Trump and his positions on how on things dealing with the United Nations? You know, he backed out of the Paris Climate Accord, right? He was
Yes.
he got out of the education arm UNESCO. And then recently he pulled out a little bit more. Where do you see this going? And what do you know about Trump? And there's some word that his father was involved with the John Birch Society somewhat. Do you know anything about that?
There's no truth to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
But go ahead about the.
Donald Trump is his own man.
Mhm.
He doesn't take advice from anybody. If he does, it's a rare instance, right? I have a good friend who was his pilot for 10 years. Flew him all over the world, all over the country, right? I said, well, Mike, what was it like working for Donald Trump? He says, great guy to work for. It was fun. It was educational for me, and I enjoyed it a lot. I said, well, why aren't you still working for him? He said, well, I told him he needed a new plane and he got a new pilot instead.
Oh, no.
So I said, can you get a message through to Trump? He says, oh, I can try. You want to send a message? I said, yeah. I said, he's going around the country saying, make America great again. Right? I said, what I want to do is send him a message. And the message simply is this: America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution. So I typed it up, large type on a single sheet of paper, no headline, no signature at the bottom, just that message. And we sent it to the gatekeeper at Trump Tower in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
It's a woman named Rhoda something.
Uh-huh.
Right? And we asked her to give it to Donald. We don't know if he ever got it or not. We don't know if he ever read it, if she gave it to him. We just don't know. But can you imagine how much good he could have done with that sentence?
Lots.
Lots, right?
Yeah.
So see, Donald Trump, he's got all the answers, right? Happily, some of the answers he has are the right ones,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I don't think it would be fun to work for him in a policy position, right? And that's probably been demonstrated by people who've come and then gone and come and gone, you know. But headstrong, so forth, but not a part of the conspiracy.
Well, that's a good thing to hear, especially from you. But his positions on the United Nations are intriguing, at least, right? I mean, the
They're
fact.
intriguing, right? He's biting off part of it, right? But if you got a loaf of bread, you have one bite out of it.
Yeah,
There's a lot more there. So, uh,
yeah, it gets rotten and you stop biting. So it just, I get it, I get it. Well, we're up against. I think we're at an hour. So, um, I wanted to be able to ask you one more question before we depart, and then if you have any further comments, you could make those. What kinds of solutions, John? You've been with the John Birch Society for a long time. It's a tireless job. It's long hours. You either have to have the fire in the belly, or you just couldn't last very long. Um, what kinds of things, what kinds of solutions can we, as coordinators or members or prospects, do to bring awareness to be able to get out of the United Nations, or expanding that into restoring liberty to this country?
well, you got to find people who are willing to do some thinking, and have them finally decide that they want to be part of the organization. You've got to sell the organization to them, right? That they don't know much about it. Uh, Something that I did. The job of a coordinator was a little bit of a roller coaster ride. Some days you're up like, and then the next day down in the dumps
It's
because
still like that.
you got disappointed by somebody, but that's life.
Yep.
Uh, if you realize that, then it doesn't bother you as much as it might. But the job can be done, right? Your part of it can be done. The members' part of it can be done. We can save our country. We've got to save our country. And I think right now there's an awful lot of people who are very disturbed about what's happening with the coronavirus and everything else.
Yeah, and where it's going next. Well, John, I appreciate your time. It's been a great hour. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Let me have time for a commercial here.
Of course, yes. Please
Right,
do.
this is my book, The History of the John Birch Society. When it came out, it cost $30. That counted for postage and handling. Price is now $20. All right. Send $20, check or money order or cash to John McManus, P.O. Box 3076 in Wakefield, Wakefield, Massachusetts, MA 01880. We'll sign the book to you and we'll send it off to you, and you'll learn a lot about the John Birch Society, who started it, what kind of people were involved, and some of the victories of the society, some of the disappointments, obviously. But you probably have the book, Tom, huh?
I do.
You've seen the picture on the cover.
Yes, I have.
That's me laughing, Robert Welch, quizzically looking at me and about to laugh.
Lift that up just a little bit more.
What were you laughing
Lift it.
about?
There you go.
People ask me, what were you laughing about?
Uh-huh.
I said I had just come back from speaking at one of the local colleges here in the Boston area, and I demanded combat pay.
That's funny.
And that's when Robert Welch started laughing.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Well, John, I hope to have you on if you'll allow me to do that again. This has been really fun, and
Well, I'm doing it with several others, your colleagues. I've got let's see, I'll just go over. I got coming engagements like this in Texas. Eldon Stahl, you know him?
yes, I do.
He just contacted me.
Good.
Mark Griffin in Minnesota,
In-
Wisconsin area. Mike Smart down in Virginia. And I've already done these with a couple of section leaders who gathered 15 or 20 people in their section over their home, and we had a meeting like that there. So I'm glad to do it. And I don't have to get in a plane to do it.
Yeah, that's good, isn't it?
Oh,
They'd probably make you wear a mask right now. So
Anyway. It's funny. Somebody told me the other day, they changed the name of our state here. It's not Massachusetts anymore. It's Massachusetts.
All right, John, I appreciate you being with us tonight. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Right.
Thank you,
Keep
sir.
smiling. Good luck with everything you're doing.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night.